Let me offer my welcome to everybody. I'm Graham Walker, president of Patrick Henry College, and I welcome you to the second in this week's series of Newsmaker interviews with Dr. Marvin Olasky. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Olasky on our faculty and teaching our students and bringing interesting people to our campus on a regular basis. You may know of Dr. Olasky that he was a professor at the University of Texas for some years in journalism, later the provost at the King's College, for 20-some years the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, author of many influential books on public policy issues and cultural analysis from a Christian perspective. He always brings to his interviews and his writings a perspective that is hinging on the truths of the inerrant Bible, and we appreciate that emphasis in Marvin Olasky's work. Today, he's bringing to us Mr. Marvin Padgett as our guest of honor today. Mr. Padgett served as the second executive director of the Great Commission Publications, the joint publishing organization of the Presbyterian Church in America and the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, OPC. He's the current president of Great Commission's Publications Board of Trustees. Previously, he worked as vice president at Crossways Books, where he was a member of the ESV Translation Oversight Committee. In 2010, he edited with someone else a book called Calvin and Culture, Exploring a Worldview, seeing how the worldview of John Calvin affected Western culture in a variety of ways. He received a degree in aerospace engineering, entered the Air Force, and served as an instructor for Air Force pilots in Colorado and Mississippi. He speaks at Labrie conferences across the country and has served as a board member of Covenant College, Good News Publishers, and Great Commission Publications. He's also a teaching elder, that is to say an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church in America. Please welcome Mr. Padgett and Marvin Olasky.
Well, thank you for coming, Marvin.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Marvin.
We always like to have this routine. You've been married to your wife, Jean, for
almost 47 years.
47 years. Mm-hmm. And you've been married to the Christian publishing industry for how many years?
Oh, gosh. I was elected to the board at Crossway in '88 and then went to work for them about 6 or 8 years after that. So a good little while. Almost all of my life has either been in education, since the first grade anyway, in education or in publishing in one way or another.
And before joining Crossway, you had a bookstore at Labrie in Switzerland with Francis Schaeffer?
I did run the Labrie bookstore for a year when we were there, and then we came back to buy a little Christian bookstore in Nashville, which we ran for about 12 years.
Okay. And so what did you learn from running bookstores as to what people read and what people don't read?
Oh, it's sometimes pretty depressing. But we endeavored to have, my wife was the gift buyer, and she didn't really want to have a gifty bookstore. So we were always heavy on books. We sold fluff. I'm sorry, that didn't come out quite right. We sold some books that were a little fluffy so that we could carry the books we really wanted to. And that sort of guided me. I never would have a book in there that I thought would harm you or a book that wasn't orthodox in some way. We did sell some books that I didn't particularly like, but that enabled me to sell all sorts of other books that I did like. The bookstore, even though it was supposed to be a for-profit place, we ran it as a ministry.
And over the past 25 years, lots of changes in Christian publishing, one of which being some of the major Christian publishers now that set out to run as ministries are now parts of big non-Christian operations and therefore supposed to do what they can for the benefit of their stockholders and supposed to look for books often that will sell regardless of whether they're biblically right or not. What are some of the changes that you've seen along those lines?
Well, all sorts of people notice that there's gold in them dark hills.
Yeah.
As the evangelical publishing industry, if you want to call it an industry, became more and more successful. We had the Year of the Bible in 1970 or 72 or something of that sort, and then the Year of the Evangelical and Time magazine. So, and the evangelicals spent a lot of money on books, and it just became very attractive, and outside investors noticed that. And so you have a lot of these grand old publishing houses that publish really good, solid Christian books, and there was no fluff at all in those books. But the business drove the companies to produce more and more things that I wouldn't want to say they were all heterodox or anything of that sort, but that there was a lot lighter, and then gifts became a big thing. I remember when I bought my Christian bookstore, buying a line of mugs, and these were really good mugs, and they didn't say anything. There was no Bible verse or anything on them. They were just a good price and a good piece of work, but they didn't sell nearly as well as the cheaper but more expensive Christian mugs that had a Bible verse on them. So you tended to put the gifts in the front of the store to try to drive people into the back of the store. We did very little of that. We did start a video club when videos was a big thing. We called it the Decent But Not Dull Video Club, and it was quite a success because we had books that were we had movies that were really quite good movies. We had every Academy Award winner outside the last 10 years, and then they just got to be where we couldn't carry them.
Yeah. Now there have been some sensational stories involving the Quran purportedly thrown in the toilet and so forth. So I wonder what Muslims make of toilet paper with biblical verses on it.
Well, of course, the Romanians did that. You know, they took Bibles and converted them into there. A friend of ours, Udo Mittelman, once told me that he was teaching in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and there was this evangelical resurgence or whatnot. And to illustrate what to do with your Bible, to stand on the Word, the American minister over there had everybody come and put their Bibles on the floor and stand on them to illustrate what it meant to be standing on the Word, not knowing how offensive that was to the Russians who treasured their Bibles.
Yeah, yeah. Zondervan, Thomas Nelson, now part of the Rupert Murdoch empire. What would we expect? What could we expect from those publishing companies as far as biblical integrity, given the constraints that their executives are under?
Well, both of those companies you mentioned and a couple of others were, of course, independent, more or less family-run Christian ministries for a long time. They became quite attractive. Zondervan was purchased by HarperCollins in '82 or '83, something like that. HarperCollins is and was a for-profit company. Their responsibilities, the management is responsible legally and morally and all that sort of thing to the stockholders. And so that what has to drive those companies is like any other for-profit company, especially the large corporations. The bottom line has got to drive them. Has there been significant drift in either one of those places? I would say at this point there hasn't been as much as I expected, but I can't help but think that over the long term it's just got to happen because the people, because they're beholden to their stockholders, and that's what a corporation's all about.
There's a little-known verse, I suppose. You cannot serve both God and mammon. You know, very well known. And is that applicable in this situation?
I think so. I mean, the really vibrant. Now, I'm prejudiced here because I worked for one of these companies and really loved it. Crossway is one of the most vibrant parts of the evangelical Christian business at this point, and it's a not-for-profit Christian ministry that is a standalone ministry. That is to say, it's not even hooked up with another Christian ministry, say the way Moody Press is. I'm not trying to be critical of Moody Press, but Crossway, both the places I worked were independent, standalone, Christian, not-for-profit ministries, and they were completely free to publish the kind of books they wanted, and more importantly, because they were confessional, that is, they had a standard of beliefs, a belief statement, they could hire whomever they wished. So they were exempt from all sorts of hiring restrictions. So they could say that you can't be a Christian. Everyone we hire has to be a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you can't work here.
Yeah. Lots of companies of all sorts are appealing in court to be immune from the Obamacare requirements concerning birth control, contraceptives, and abortifacients. Are any publishers in any of those cases?
I don't know. I would guess so, but I don't know.
Okay. But that's something one would hope that some of these publishers would if they are.
Sure.
So, okay.
Well, Crossway and P&R and Moody and InterVarsity and also the ones that are independent and are not owned by a large corporation are more immune to that sort of a stand,
right,
because they're not in it to make a profit, and so they can maintain things as long as it's written down and can be derived from their doctrinal statement.
Now, What should consumers know about the whole way in which books typically, especially by big-name authors, are produced?
Well, of course, there's a current controversy that's ongoing right now. You have to be careful and evaluate the things. It's one of the things you should look to see who's endorsing the books, because most of the people that I knew who endorsed the books were honest about it, and so they wouldn't. You wouldn't find, say, John MacArthur endorsing a book that was written by someone who didn't have a biblically based perspective. That's one way. It worries me a little bit. Now, I read pretty widely. I tell people I read like a vacuum cleaner. I'll read almost anything that's put in front of me. And so I read books that are Christian books and are not Christian books. I'm a lot more careful about the Christian books. On the other hand, I do want to know what other people are thinking. And I don't know whether that's helpful in all this, but I can't help but think that the large corporation, Rupert Murdoch, owns the rights to the most popular Bible translation of the world, and that's bothersome. That's the NIV. I know lots of people use the NIV. I read the NIV when I'm studying. I don't preach out of the NIV or teach out of it, but it strikes me as this is a dangerous place to be.
What are some of the other dangers, do you think, that are facing the Christian publishing industry right now?
Well, because there's gold in them there hills, and Christians spend it, and the great masses are not as discerning as they need to be, and largely many of the megachurch pastors are not as discerning as they need to be. I'd be worried that people will drift because they're going to be reading the pablum that's served up, and if something is being sold and it sells a lot, the Christian public tends to go and read those things. And I don't want to really get into a lot of the names of the books, but there's some books that are sold widely in Christian bookstores that are bothersome today, stuff that I wouldn't have sold.
Can I ask you for some names?
Oh, shoot. I was hoping you wouldn't say that. You know, I don't want to duck your question because I'm afraid of offending someone, but I don't read those books and I'm not that familiar with them.
Well, let's talk about some other names then. One of the questions that arises often involves ghostwriting. And if we set up a spectrum of well-known people, one of the things I understand is that John Piper, actually writes every word of his own books.
John Piper is one of the finest people I've ever met, and I was privileged to work with him with books at Crossway. We did several books there. What you see in John Piper is what you get. He is one of the most straightforward, completely honest, sold-out people I've ever been around. He writes his books himself. He was an English major at Wheaton, and it shows. He writes like an angel, I tell people. His books come in and rarely need any corrections. John would take a writing leave in the summer, and his church would let him go off and spend some time alone, and he would just sit there and write like a machine. But his books are his books. Does everybody have to do that? What's his name? Drucker. I can't remember his first name.
Peter
Drucker said the 3 hardest jobs in America were being president of the United States, the CEO of a large corporation, and the senior pastor of a megachurch. Those guys, if they're going to have a church of that size, simply will not have the time to, if they're going to pastor at all, to do all this. So I don't have any problem with some of the big-name Christian megachurch pastors having someone help them write their books, as long as they control what's being said. Now, I know John MacArthur is that way. He's a busy man. He's got a large, bustling church. He has very qualified people on his staff to take his sermons and his teachings and convert them into a book. After all, a sermon is one form of art, if you will, and a book is another form of art. They're different media, and so you say things differently when you're preaching it than if you were writing it. And so he has a staff that takes his sermons, transcribes them, and then edits them, and then presents them back to John MacArthur. And so the book that shows up in your Christian bookstore is the real thing. Now, did he sit down and type it out the way Jimmy Carter famously said he did all of his books? He doesn't. Most of the big-time pastors and big-time Christian writers do have people who assist them. And I don't have a problem with that. I do really like it, though, when they give credit to the ghostwriter or to the editor, whatever you want to call them.
So let's talk a bit about the ethics of ghostwriting and then get back to some individual cases. If a ghostwriter, I've had one ghostwriter who has told me, I received $25,000 to write this manuscript. That was the deal. I didn't ask for any credit. I wasn't given any credit, but that's fine with me because I have the $25,000. Any problem with that?
Well, it all depends on what you mean. As someone who loves the economic system that the Anglo-American world has, you can contract for anything. It's not illegal, immoral, or fattening. And so he's done that, and he's given up the right to do that, and that's okay. So I don't think he or the author, or whatever you want to call the person, has done anything illegal. What bothers me are the people in the Christian bookstores are being, in a sense, deceived by thinking that so-and-so wrote all these books. So I like it much better when someone says, with John Jones with Sue Jones or Sue Smith or something of that sort. So it identifies that. Ghostwriting, if there are a lot of books that wouldn't be written if there weren't ghostwriters. Some people are just awfully busy. Do they need to sit down in front of a word processor and write every word? Or is it sufficient for them to sit down with a tape recorder and let someone else take it? I'd say as long as they retain control over it, it's okay. Do I really like it? No, I don't really like it, but I'd say it's okay.
So of these three types of folks who are very busy, in Peter Drucker's words, the politicians, the CEOs, and the senior pastors, we pretty much don't expect politicians to be writing their own stuff. I mean, we know they have speechwriters. Peggy Noonan has become famous as Reagan's speechwriter at some point. Others are well known for that purpose, and they actually take on lives of their own. So we don't expect that. When it comes to CEOs, we don't expect people who have the talents needed to make a great CEO will also have the talents needed to make a great writer.
Right.
And athletes are in the same category.
And there are people who just can't write.
Right.
But have something to say, and it's important to hear what they have to say. And if you have to have somebody help you do that, that's okay with me, because what you have to say, what you've thought about, what you've experienced may be important and may be very helpful. I don't like the deception to where someone claims to actually have sat down and written the book and hadn't done that.
So even if the person whose name is on the book and the writer have an agreement and they're satisfied with that, that is not satisfying for the third person in this whole thing, namely the reader.
That's what I think. Yeah.
Okay. Then among pastors, on the third of Drucker's category, senior pastors, because they do use words, we expect them to have the ability to be articulate not only in the pulpit but on the page. And when they don't, when they're not writing their own stuff, we do feel deceived in a way that we don't feel with CEOs or politicians or athletes. So let's go through some people here. Francis Schaeffer gave talks and then had people transcribing them.
They were taped. Almost every word he uttered was taped, and then someone would transcribe it, and then Schaeffer would go over the manuscript, or whatever, the transcript, I guess you'd call it, and turn it into what he wanted, and then it would be sent off. He had secretaries that he employed to go over the things that he did. Schaeffer retained control. Schaeffer retained minute control, actually, over his manuscripts, to where it was sometimes a little frustrating to work with him because he insisted on saying things his way. And as you've read Schaeffer, I know you've read Schaeffer and listened to him, Schaeffer had his own quirky ways of saying things. What makes Schaeffer powerful in his writing is that comes across in his writings is the passion for what he's saying, and the content of what he's saying. Not necessarily the high quality of the writing.
Okay. So the job of the transcriber would be stick with that,
yes,
and make sure the passion shows through. Don't try to stop that or reduce that in any way.
They had some bad experiences early on when they first began to write books, and there was an early book he wrote, I think it was either Escape from Reason or The God Who Is There, and he sent it to the publisher, and he spoke of all human beings having moral emotions. And they sent it back to Schaeffer having changed it to moral emotions. And they went back and forth several times because the publisher didn't know what Schaeffer was really trying to say. And that made, they became very careful about who they let work on their books.
Okay. And then Schaeffer published with InterVarsity.
InterVarsity, Tyndale,
And then Crossway at a certain point.
Crossway, Revell, which was eventually published by Baker, and I think they dropped Schaeffer's books. Revell did. The rest of the people have hung on to them.
Okay. And then Edith Schaeffer, what was she like to be working with?
Well, I only did one book with Edith, and it was one of his books. One of the most popular tape series that Schaeffer did in his entire life were lectures he gave at a cafe in Lausanne on Romans, and it's just brilliant. And everybody who went to L'Abri loved these things, but it was never written down. So I got a copy of the tapes and gave it to a rewrite editor, and he actually did most. He didn't do the transcription; someone else did, and he reworked it. And then I took it to Edith one day in Rochester, Minnesota, and sat there with her while she read the whole thing.
Okay.
And it was demanding. When her very first book was the L'Abri story. And they sent it to the publisher, and the publisher sent it back to them and said, we can't really publish this the way it is because it doesn't have enough happy endings in it. And their response was, this is the way real life was at L'Abri. And fortunately, the publisher acquiesced, and we just have a fine book by Edith Schaeffer, which is really theologically attuned. Her book, Affliction, by the way, just to diverge, my interest area in graduate school was the problem of evil. And I think her book, Affliction, is one of the finest treatments I've ever read. It's really quite good. So both of the Schaeffers had an awful lot to say, but it was the content that drove them.
But did every chapter of Affliction end with a happy story?
No, it didn't.
So
That's life.
And where's the L'Abri situation comedy at this point with half-hour shows in which everything is wrapped up at the end and everyone's laughing together? So we haven't seen that yet.
No.
So John MacArthur. Tell us about experience.
John MacArthur is a delightful man. He is a dogmatic preacher. He's a very careful preacher. He preaches his way through the Bible. All the books that he writes they're taken from his sermons. They're taken from the work that he did. He employed two well-qualified editors. One who'd been the editorial director, I think, at Moody Press before going to work for him. He's a very dynamic individual. His books are filled with content. Once again, the two guys who worked for him to do this took the sermons that were spoken orally, aloud, and transferred those into something written. John retained control of the books. Nothing would dare come out of Grace to You, is that what it was called? Grace to You Ministries, that he hadn't approved. He's a fine example of that. These people weren't ghostwriters. They were editors who took what he had said, or even took it, I don't know whether John preaches from a manuscript or not. Either they took what he'd said that had been transcribed or the sermon notes that he used and transferred those into book form. Very few people like to read books that appear to be collections of sermons, and so one of their jobs was to smooth it out and make it, instead of 13 or 14 different selections of things, make it appear to be a smooth running book, which it is. But he never lost control.
Okay. So this is legitimate. These are the pastor's ideas.
Right.
You're just taking it and turning it into a different medium, but really not adding new thoughts to it.
Yeah, I'm quite sure that was true of Lloyd Jones. I think his daughters did that for him, converting what he said, and he preached 3 times a week. He wouldn't have had time to read. He preached on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, and I think also on Saturday evening. I think that's when he did his magnificent thing on Romans, was on Saturday evenings, which ran for 14 years.
Okay. And then Jack Graham in Dallas?
Jack Graham.
With Prestonwood Baptist?
Prestonwood Baptist Church.
Plano, actually. Yeah.
Pardon?
Plano, north of Dallas.
It's in Plano. It used to be in Prestonwood, and they moved it and just kept the name. Okay. Jack Graham is a very influential man in the Southern Baptist Convention, a really, really good guy. He preaches, I think, to 27,000 people on the weekends, 3 or 4 sermons a weekend. Jack has someone take his material and convert it. You know, it's transcribed, and then an editor takes it and transforms it into something. It goes back to Jack, and then it goes from Jack to the publishing house. His books reflect what he thought. At one point, I talked to Jack fairly frequently.
Okay. So, no, I won't push you on specific names then, since I don't think you'd be willing to tell them. But is it widely known in the Christian publishing industry that there are senior pastors who have books coming out that they really don't have that type of involvement with?
Yeah, that would be true. They're more like the kinds of people you've been talking about before, the CEOs and the politicians. The books are written for them, and their ideas drive them, but it isn't specifically their work.
So in World 20 years ago, we had an article on a cover story on ghostwriting that actually did affect the behavior of at least one notable person and perhaps others. We're looking to have a similar story this year. The problem we're finding is the people who know most about it are the ghostwriters, but they are unwilling really to speak, at least to speak on the record, because that's their future livelihood that would be in jeopardy. So how would you suggest looking into this?
Well, I mean, the one that's attracted so much attention, and it's a bit of a public controversy, is on some books that Mark Driscoll wrote. He's been published by any number of publishing houses, including Crossway. It appears that some of his books someone has picked up wholesale from another book someone else wrote and just more or less pasted it in to his book. And so he's being investigated, I think, by Crossway, because Crossway has published some of his books, and also I think the NAV Press is, because NAV Press has discovered some of their material showing up in Mark Driscoll's books.
So this becomes public when there's an issue of plagiarism, and you can just compare different texts and see that. Is plagiarism a big problem that you see in the Christian publishing industry, or just an incidental thing occasionally?
I hope it's occasionally. Every book contract that I ever worked on but one, that was one of the first I did, and I just gave up something. There's a clause in the contract that says the author has to hold the publishing house harmless in legal action to prevent that sort of thing. C.S. Lewis, interestingly, who of course no one would claim that Lewis didn't write his own books, he wrote them out by hand, I think. C.S. Lewis had such a mind that if he read anything 15 years later, he could repeat it for you. And so there were instances in Lewis's talking, I'm not sure about the books, to where he would pick up things. It wasn't that Lewis was copying people, it's just that he had such a photographic mind that sometimes other people's stuff would come out very close to what they had written, because it was just embedded in his hard drive, if you will.
Yeah. Chuck Swindoll, by the way, I was reading something that he had written about his writing process, and he says he actually writes his things by hand, and he has calluses to prove it on his fingers. So, I mean, that would be the type of evidence that would be very useful to have. What ethical problems do you see based on your experience at Crossway, P&R, and just talking with people from other companies? What do you see as the major ethical problems now within Christian publishing?
Well, I'd have to say that the two companies that I worked with and I'm most familiar with are basically well run. They're run by Christian people, and they're scrupulously honest. So I haven't personally experienced it. There are an awful lot of books that get written that I'm suspicious about, because one, they're written very quickly, and they don't appear to mark the way what you know about the author. And of course, this is mostly the celebrity Christians and whatnot, who just would rather have someone write it for them. In terms of coming up with names for people like that, I know almost none of the names. Okay. And that's because of the work I did. Now, I have my suspicions.
Okay. And then how would you go about checking your suspicions? What would be your process from your knowledge of the industry to?
Oh gosh, I've never thought about that.
Every once in a while, I want to ask a question like that.
I know. I was responsible at both publishing houses for the content of all the books, so I would certainly read them in manuscript form, and I read enough to where if there was something I was to be suspicious about, I would ask about them. But I never personally encountered one of those. And that's a tribute, I think, to the authors that are attracted to people like Crossway and P&R. Right.
For readers of books, any telltale signs if they're reading something? When should they be suspicious? I mean, for the folks who are here or reading,
when should
any
you be
suggestions?
Suspicious? Well, I guess I would say as I read books, if it doesn't ring true, but the easiest and most effective way to do this is to read reviews like crazy.
Okay.
Because reviewers are supposed to know more than what's on the page in front of them. They're not supposed to know about what's on the page in front of them, but they're supposed to know what other people have written about the same subject. I do read a lot of reviews, and I know of one really good place to find reviews, that you know about quite well.
Tell us about that place.
It's in World Magazine.
World Magazine, I've heard of that, yes. Okay. Folks who are potential ghostwriters here in the audience, now ghostwriters are often, unless occasionally they become celebrity ghostwriters, like Peggy Noonan, in which case they're no longer so ghostly.
But presidential speeches are a little different thing, because presidential speeches are so important. It's like Calvin Coolidge said, every word the president says weighs a ton. And so it's presidential speeches sometimes run off the rails when they begin to ad lib.
Right.
Now, I'd hate to think that the speeches that the presidents give and the governors and whatnot don't have some sort of review. Of course, Reagan was famous for going over things in a lot of detail. How many other people do that, I don't know. He was a real wordsmith, though.
Yeah, a long time ago, I was a speechwriter at the DuPont Company, and multiple drafts in which the chief lawyer of the company, the chief economist, the senior vice president of this or that, I mean, they would all be looking at it. I mean, multiple reviews, and so, President of the United States must be much more so.
But ghostwriting in general, I don't have any ethical problems with it at all, because like I said a few minutes ago, not everybody can write well. I tend to give more talks than write. I'm just a miserable writer, so if anyone was ever going to publish anything that I wrote, it would have to be worked over pretty carefully, because I just don't write effectively. I'd hate for the world to be deprived of everybody's ideas merely because they had to sit down with their word processor or their pen and write everything. I think it's okay for there to be ghostwriter. As a reader and as a bookseller, I really would like to know that was the case, so I would know that whoever says they'd written this book, that somebody had helped them out.
So if some of these students here at Patrick Henry want to be ghostwriters, they're dealing from a position of weakness.
Oh, yeah.
But what should they, for basic bottom line ethics, what should they stipulate? What should they be willing to give up and what they should? I mean, to be specific, should they always demand, as best they can, that they be credited in some way, like as told to or with or something?
You're unlikely to get jobs initially if you do that.
Yeah.
Once you become well known, I mean, you mentioned Peggy Noonan. We all know that she wrote speeches for Reagan. We probably didn't know that she wrote speeches for Reagan the first 2 or 3 times that she did it.
Right.
So you have to build up your street cred or your credibility with the authors so that they'll have confidence that you can do it. And once you become well known in that trade, if you will, then you can insist on any number of things.
So basic advice, at least initially, you just have to start doing it, and you're going to be dealing from a position of weakness, accept that.
Yeah, when you're in a position of weakness, you just can't squeeze that much. And that's whether you're buying grapefruit in an open air market, or whether you're trying to be a speechwriter or a ghostwriter. You have to be careful, because if you begin to squeeze a writer, or if you begin to squeeze a publisher and demanding that I have this or I want that, they may be much less likely to pay you as much, and secondly, not nearly as likely to do something. If you begin your career by being a troublemaker, there are risks in that. I'm not saying people shouldn't be troublemakers, but that's a risk you take when you do that.
Okay. One more question, then we'll open it up for questions from the floor. How should I put this? Over your 25 years or so in publishing, is there less interest now than there used to be in publishing a good manuscript if the author doesn't have a platform to promote it?
Absolutely. I mean, the platform is something that every publisher is going to look for, because if you have a platform, you have a means to sell the book yourselves. And so ministries, one of the first things that I would ask, of a big-time author or a pastor is, how many books will your ministry purchase? And that makes it more attractive. That makes publishers more likely to take a risk with books, even by well-known pastors.
In that sense, the divide between self-publishing, or what used to be called vanity press, and commercial publishers is less than it used to be, right? Because people are, to a certain extent, expected for those folks or their ministries are expected to buy a certain number of books or guarantee certain sales, right? Isn't that a type of self-publishing in a way?
It is. That opens a whole other vista about the thing about what we, like you said, we used to call vanity, the vanity press, and now self-publishing. If you write The Shack, you're going to make far more money publishing it yourself than finding any publisher in the world to publish it. Because the nice thing about that is you get all of the take from it. Whereas if you do a $20 book, let's say, if a retail, royalties in the Christian market are based on the selling price that the publisher gets.
Right.
So if you have a $20 book and you sell that to Ingram, Ingram is going to get 60% of that. They're going to get a 60% discount. So Ingram is going to get, the publisher who sells to Ingram is going to get
$8.
$8 is all they're going to get, and you're going to get your 10 to 16, 17, 18% of the $8, which is down around $1.
Right.
So on the other hand, you do make it up in volume. Ingram gets a huge discount that regular bookstores don't get because they're the biggest, they're the 800-pound gorilla. You can't, if you hit it, you can sell an awful lot of your own books and you make a lot of money. There was a group of people who approached me several years ago, wanted to know which I thought, and I said, well, you're likely to make more money if you let us publish it. I said, on the other hand, if it just goes nuts, then you'll do better. And they didn't take my advice and did it themselves, and about 3 years later came back to me and said, well, would you pick this book up now?
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, we did, and we sold it quite well. And my guess is that they made a lot more money on the books that we sold, even though they got a smaller cut. But the guy who wrote The Shack has made himself into a millionaire.
Yeah. Good. Questions from any of you, including aspiring authors?
This might be a little bit off topic since we've been talking about non-fiction works primarily, but for any aspiring fiction writers in the audience, does the same platform, or need to build a platform, hold in those instances, or does it change when you're not coming to the public as okay, here I'm an influential leader in this or that movement, but instead you're coming and saying, here I'm a person who has a story to tell?
It's harder. It's harder because you don't have this thing to build upon. But it isn't impossible, and secondly, it's just part. A book that Crossway sold very successfully. Now, you may or may not think it's great literature, but it was the first Frank Peretti book, and it was rejected 17 times. Now, this book, almost more than any other, was set the Christian fiction market on its way. But it was rejected 17 times because Christians didn't understand fiction. I still don't think Christians understand fiction, as a matter of fact. And it's not because of Frank. Frank tells a good tale. It's good, healthy reading and all that sort of stuff. The thing that I told a group of, I'm from Nashville, and I got to talk to a bunch of Christian musicians once out on somebody's front lawn, and I said, the one thing I'd urge you to do is not to do Christian music. That is to say, not to strive to have it so lavishly, if you will, Christian, that you aren't producing something of real art. So is it harder? It's harder to get started in fiction? It is. A nice thing to do if you can run across an agent is you can pitch, and that's something we haven't mentioned, but that is going off on a rabbit trail. You can Google and find yourself an agent, and an agent will be able to, one, help you with your manuscript, and secondly, will know supposed to know which publisher is likely to pick it up. And an agent can get you into doors that you can't possibly get into by yourself. So I'd try that. I would try doing it, but just work hard on it. Fiction is a tougher sell. Christians don't understand fiction very well. And that's one of the reasons the state of Christian fiction is so poor. There's an award given every year, the Christie Award, for the best Christian fiction piece, and one of the finalists one year was a demon-possessed submarine. I didn't say the crew was, the submarine itself was demon-possessed, and this won one of the great awards, and it's called the Christie Award, and that's after Catherine Marshall's book, Christie. My guess is Catherine Marshall, she was a wonderful writer. Catherine Marshall was probably unaware that she was writing Christian fiction, although she did. I mean, her books are really quite good. So it's harder to break in fiction because there's so much garbage out there. And secondly, we looked at Crossway. P&R did very little fiction. We published his wife. We published Susan's books on the American Revolution. We published some fairly well, but Crossway was looking for what we call literary fiction. We didn't want to publish just anything that would sell. I hope that's helpful. But if you can land an agent, and I can give you some names if you wish of people who are discerning. An agent is something that no publisher would admit they liked, but agents can help authors and can help publishers as well. But that's a good place to start. You know, you pitch a manuscript to an agent. Write short stories. They're easier to get published. I think they're harder to write, but they're easier to get published.
Get published where?
Short stories?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness! And Christian short stories. The short stories that I run across most are in Commentary, which is a Jewish journal. You know, I don't know.
It's a yeah.
It's a hard row to hoe.
It is. It is. Other questions, David?
Coming, this is a fascinating conversation. I think there's a perception in book publishing in general and also Christian publishing that it's kind of become a celebrity-driven industry. Can you talk a little bit on the inside of Christian publishing, how you balance the tension between content and message versus marketing and sales? And you have a book by a celebrity Christian versus an unknown who has a great book, a great message. Whose book do you publish first?
Let me say this about the celebrity publishing thing. Celebrity publishing is not a Christian publishing problem. It's a publishing problem in general, and beyond that, it's also a cultural problem. We are all just absorbed in the well-nigh worship of celebrities, and so that just boils over into the general book publishing market. It may have been there forever, and because it was successful there, the Christians aped it. The church. I used to tell people that if you look at issues in our culture today, if you wait 10 years, the Christians will be concerned about it also. We have a long cultural lag. So the reason that some of the big-time Christian publishers have become celebrity-driven is because that's, once again, where that kind of money is. What would we do? Fortunately for me, both of the publishing houses I worked with had a policy against publishing contemporary biographies, for example. So we didn't publish anything except once we did a biography of Billy Graham, sort of figuring that if Billy Graham wasn't safe, nobody was. So we did a biography of Billy Graham. But in general, we didn't do any of them, and that was because we had a more principled stand about that, I think, than did other publishers. Now, if you mean, did we publish some of the authors we've mentioned here? Was it easier? Did we want to publish John MacArthur and John Piper and Francis Schaeffer because they were well known? And the answer to that is yes. The first book that Crossway ever published was a book by Francis Schaeffer called A Christian Manifesto. It was number one on the bestseller list for a good long while. Was it because Schaeffer was a big name? No, it wasn't. It was because Lane Dennis, the president at Crossway, had a personal relationship with Francis Schaeffer and really had a passion to publish books that other publishers didn't want to pick up. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for coming here today. I'm wondering, you stated that beginning ghostwriters cannot make demands to be credited, but you also said that it's deception to not note that there was an editor or a ghostwriter. So then is it acceptable to be part of a deception at first when we're starting out?
Well, I personally like to know if you've written, if a book comes out with your name on it, that somebody helped you. And so I insisted that the books say, June Smith with so-and-so, or June Smith and so-and-so. And as time went on, it appears to me that in the Christian market, that became more the case than not. There are a couple of egregious cases where friendships and professional relationships and business relationships were destroyed because the star refused to give any credit to the other one. Is it being part of a deception? I think ghostwriting is a common enough practice that everybody knows goes on, to where it's okay with me to do it legally. Personally, I like to know it. Do I think I'm being deceived if I don't know it? Just a little bit, yeah. Did I feel like I was part of a deception in publishing some books that I knew that were rewritten? I never did that because the books that we published were always controlled by the person who was the author, even though they didn't do the entry into the word processor. They had preached it or they had taught it or something of that sort.
Could I offer just a follow-up to what Hannah said there? So I think the message there is that because you're in a position of weakness as a young startup writer, it's okay to be complicit in a deception. Yes, it's okay? Or no, it's not okay?
Wouldn't it be helpful if the CBA, Christian Book Association, had a code of ethics laying out what should not be done in terms of deception?
Probably. It'd be very difficult to enforce, but it would probably be a good idea to say something like that. But I don't mind the fact that someone has ghostwritten, except that one of my favorite things, though, was an athlete a few years ago who sued his publisher over his autobiography because they said the things in the book weren't true. And this was billed as an autobiography, so it meant this guy was supposed to have written it himself. Now that's definitely a problem and resulted in a lawsuit. Now at that point, we've gone well beyond ghostwriting into just outright and complete deception. We've almost gotten into the area of fiction, in a sense, when you start doing that. But if you have someone sit down and talk into a tape recorder for a long time, or if you even draw their sermons or their articles or whatnot together in a book and someone else does that, that doesn't constitute a serious problem for me. I think that even if they don't get credit, but I really, because I know this one personal case, I mean, it wasn't involving me, where it just destroyed someone, almost destroyed them personally because the big star would give them no credit whatsoever. And very little money besides.
Yeah, a further step in memoir disintegration is that of a baseball pitcher who, in his autobiography, made several accusing statements about other players, and when asked about that by reporters, the pitcher said, "How would I know? I haven't read it."
Yeah.
So, anyway.
We hope that doesn't occur in Christian publishing.
So, Susan?
I'm just wondering if
Mike.
If you're setting out to be a writer, maybe a ghostwriter, obviously you talk through these things before you sign, and there's something wrong with the celebrity or the preacher if they are if they're so resistant to giving credit. I would think you wouldn't want to sign on and work with that person. There should at least be an acknowledgement in the acknowledgements page of the editorial help.
Well, there often is, and sometimes it's hidden away on the copyright page, too, which is a place that no one but people like me look anyway. Yeah, more people look at the acknowledgements page than look at the copyright page.
Yeah, where do you bury a dead body on the copyrights page?
Pardon?
Where do you bury a dead body on the
right.
copyrights page? Anyway, yeah. Other questions, David?
You were talking about the role of agents and that Christian publishers maybe wouldn't want to admit the influence agents have or the need for agents. Be interested in your insights, having had some experience both as a co-author and a ghostwriter. I have my own ideas about that, but I think there's a perception that agents in many ways kind of control the market by vetting a lot of the content before they even get to the publisher.
Oh, yes. Agents have had the effect, agents moving in, if you will, into the Christian publishing world have had the effect of boosting advances to authors and bidding up the cost of books, and that makes the books more expensive for people. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's really hard to know. It does make it hard for small publishers to compete. Agents can be of a lot of help to both people. We were doing a book at Crossway once that was co-written by two people, and one of them really didn't do much writing, and they had what we like to call euphemistically a moral failure. And the agent called me up and said, "This is what has happened. and this is what we're going to do about it. And the person who had the so-called moral failing and the author both agreed that he was to be taken out of the book altogether. And you couldn't tell if you picked up that book that anything like that had happened. That was the time where an agent did a lot of good by talking to people and says, we can't do this. I had another agent once. There was a large ministry that wanted to do a book, and they wanted to do it very quickly. And I was just saying, we can't do this for X months. Even if you gave it to me, I couldn't do that. And I was getting more embarrassed as the moment went on. And finally, the agent piped up and said, look, what Marvin is telling you is what every publisher in the whole place would tell you. And so they can be very helpful. The agent's job, though, is to represent the author. And that can be good and bad. It can make things more expensive for the publisher, and it can make things more lucrative for the author.
Other questions?
Is there a market for Christian poetry?
Poetry?
Yes.
Both the publishing houses for which I worked did not do poetry, which I think is a great shame. Harold Shaw used to be a place where Christian poetry was published, and they didn't exactly specialize in it, but that's where you went if you had a book of poetry. It's a really tough sell. I don't have any experience publishing poetry because neither Crossway nor P&R would publish poetry. Now, that's not to say that there wouldn't sometimes be a small amount of verse in a book, but if you're talking about publishing poetry as poetry, it's a tough thing. Part of it is, well, this is going to sound awfully harsh, is Christians don't know how to read. And because of that, that's why Christian fiction can be such a wasteland. It can be why poetry, because poetry requires concentration, whereas a fast-paced novel doesn't require a lot of attention. You have to listen carefully to it. It's the same way if you're listening to a symphony. It takes more effort to listen to a symphony than it does to a rock musician. I'm not saying rock musicians aren't creative, but it's a tougher thing to listen and appreciate something that Bach did than it is some of the contemporary stuff that's done. That's the reason, I think. I think Christians are undiscerning about fiction, and secondly, poetry is hard, and sadly, most Christians don't want hard. I'm sorry to be negative about it. I hope you're able to get it published. There are magazines and journals that do publish poetry. One of my favorites is the New Criterion, and they have poetry in every issue. I've got one here in my bag if you want to look at it when we finish, so you can see what they're doing. It's a wonderful magazine about their literary commentary as well, and their political commentary and cultural commentary, but they do publish poetry every single issue, and they have one issue that's devoted to poetry each year.
We've talked about sermons actually preached by the pastors and then turned into books, and I think we're in agreement there's not an ethical problem of that if there's someone there who just transcribes and then edits. But there are increasing rumors, and not involving any of the people we've talked about senior pastors who actually have their sermons ghostwritten by others. What, if anything, can you tell us about that?
Well, I'll have to confess I'm a thoroughgoing Calvinist, and Calvin believed that when a minister preached, a faithful minister preached, that he was in effect preaching the Word of God. I mean, he didn't believe in continuing revelation, but he had a very high view of the pulpit, and I think all Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and all sorts do as well. That would be awfully offensive to me to think that someone else was writing the pastor's sermon. It just, I mean, what we're doing is we're coming to church, and we think this person is anointed by the Spirit of God to bring us the message. And Calvin had once again had such a high view of it. If somebody was writing his sermons for them, I'd be disappointed. Now, in the PCA in the last 15 or 20 years, there have been two men who lost big pulpits, if you will, because it was discovered that they were plagiarizing people thoroughly. And I'm glad that happened. I'm sorry. I'm glad the action was taken. I'm sad that it actually happened, but the churches took swift action.
Okay.
So you mentioned the difference. You mentioned agents doing some good. Is there a way to tell when selecting an agent an agent that is likely to accomplish good as opposed to an agent that's likely to just, get on publishers' nerves?
That's a really hard question to answer. I mean, I could give you a list. I'm not going to do that because I don't work in that area quite anymore. But it's just there are some agents who just more or less just cash checks and don't do much. They act just merely as brokers and don't get involved helping the author or otherwise. You need to find someone who is really going to be interested in your book. You just need to talk to them, and once at the end of it, it's just a personal decision. Who are you going to? Do you trust this man or woman to represent you? You need to find out who they are, and you may even want to ask them who they've represented to see what kind of books they're done. But I mean, there are some wonderful people who are agents, and there are some people who just cash checks. The people who are wonderful usually are book lovers, and they really love books, and they want to see the books distributed more widely, and they represent these authors, and the authors do better because they have an agent. Because agents are tougher to deal with, and that's, for you as an author, is a good thing. For me as a publisher, it was hard sometimes.
Susan, that mic.
Which came first, the Christian publishers that had to have a salvation scene in a piece of fiction, or the Christian reader who demanded that from Christian fiction?
Oh, what a shrewd question. Not that I'm surprised that you'd ask a shrewd question. I don't know the answer to that. I think that it's because Christians, like I said about the poetry, don't want something hard. Christians are impatient because we have such a, I started to say easygoing relationship with Jesus, and I put that in quotes because we have such a, everything is okay. Whatever I think is okay. And so we have a lower standard than people surrounding us do. I mean, that's why New York books, if you look at a New York published books, it's a work of art. New York publishers really publish beautiful books. They do a great job. And so the New York market is more demanding than Christians. And Christians are people who don't want to say anything. What was that movie all those years? The book, Love Means Not Having to Say You're Sorry. Because we're supposed to love each other, we can't be critical about things. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. My guess is it was an attempt to Christianize some low-level fiction by publishers.
Along those lines, what percentage of endorsements for books do you think are actually written by endorsers who have read the books?
Well, I'm not going to tell you who this is, but there was a publisher, an author that we did, who wanted his book endorsed by a famous member of his congregation. And the famous member of his congregation contacted me and said, "This is how much I will charge you to endorse the book." And so because we really, really wanted to publish the book and we respected the author and we respected the person, we said, okay. It turns out that the pastor himself wrote the endorsement for his own book and left a blank in the middle of it. It says, you can add your personal comments here and send it to the endorser. And the endorser sent it to me and said, I don't think I need to add anything. This is good enough as it is.
So ghost-written endorsements for ghost-written books.
That was a pretty disappointing episode, actually. Endorsements help you as a reader to see if people that you respect endorse a book. At P&R, our best endorser was Tim Keller. And when Tim Keller put his name on a book, it sold a lot more books. And that's one of the reasons publishers do it, to sell more books. But it also does help you to be able to see, well, if I respect so-and-so, he's probably telling me the right thing. I flip a book over in the back to check for endorsements before I buy most books.
As we conclude, let me just thank you all for being here. Thank those who joined us via our live webcast. And of course, ultimately, we'll be joined by the 400,000 some readers of World Magazine as these interviews are eventually published in the written form there by Dr. Olasky. Stay tuned for more interviews this week. Tomorrow at 12:40, Marvin Olasky will be interviewing Mark Meckler, president of the Tea Party Patriots, who's involved in the Convention of States activity. That should be pretty interesting. The following day, on Thursday, will be an interview at 12:20 with Bob Fu, who's the president of China Aid Association, a longtime dear friend of mine personally. He'll be talking about the future of Christianity in China. Then on Friday at 12:40, Tina Ramirez will be talking about global social justice issues with Marvin Olasky. But for now, please give thanks to Marvin Olasky and Marvin Padgett.
Thank you. Thank you. That was fun.